Do you want to minimize your practice's overhead and run lean? Stay tuned to find out how. Let's get lean. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we're getting lean. So we have Dr. Mitra Sadhu, who is a nephrologist and a champion for lean practice. So by establishing her own lean private practice, she cares for patients as she envisioned while still finding time for her family, travel, and personal interests. So she shares her experience and insights on lean private practice solutions. Additionally, she addresses the high cost of medical office space with her other venture, Link Medical Spaces, an online platform connecting health professionals to available medical spaces like Tinder for finding office space for either for lease or sublet. So Dr. Sadhu, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here, Dr. Block. It's a pleasure. And thank you for the introduction.
So let's talk about lean practice first, because I think that happens a lot, right? You end up with this like practice bloat as you try and get busier and optimize and optimize and optimize. You hire more and more people in order to make sure that your time is well spent and you've outsourced everything you can, but then you've got to work really hard in order for that massive overhead. So the question is, if we're trying to lean out our practice, we first need to figure out where we're spending our money. And so what are those biggest expenses in a medical practice?
Absolutely. So that's the traditional model, right? I call it keeping up with the Joneses in the practice setting. You got to have what you think and what maybe society thinks an office should look like and staff should look like and everything else that comes with it. So the biggest expenses for, I think, any medical practice of any size is office space, whether you are renting or leasing or you have your own space, and staff, in-office staff. I think those would be, everything else pales in comparison, whether it's marketing and billing and supplies and everything else.
Because those are traditionally fixed expenses, right? Like when you hire a staff member, you're hiring them full-time. When you're renting office space, when you're utilizing office space, you're using it full-time because the assumption is that you're going to be the only person there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Unless we're thinking out of the box and okay with doing some things differently, that is how it has looked so far.
Okay, so how do we think out of the box and do things differently?
So I'll tell you my experience with the office space. When I was doing a very back of the napkin kind of calculation for the numbers, I always knew right from the outset that I wanted to work part-time. It's what I thought would keep me from getting burnt out, because that is what I was reading about everywhere. So I wanted to work part-time also because I wanted to save my energy for my kids as well as my patients. Now, how do you start and run a practice and work part-time in today's day and age with the rising cost of doing business and falling reimbursement? So when I was doing the math, I figured, at least in my neck of the woods, with the way costs are with office space, if I were to rent a traditional space, I would be seeing, I don't know, the first 50 patients a month just to pay the rent. And I was like, that's not going to work. So I looked around. I ideally wanted to sublease office space from another established practice, but that did not go anywhere. I couldn't find anything, and I had no resource to turn to either. So I found this shared workspace location. It's not medical specific. I work with the lawyers and accountants, therapists. There's maybe one or two other physicians there. When I first started, I started without a footprint in town. I didn't have a patient base following me. So when I got my first patient, I rented out the space for 1 hour for a grand total of $32. And so if you think of it like that, barring startup expenses, I was net positive from the very first patient. It was that way for another few weeks until I had a couple more patients, and then I rented it for the morning and went on so and so forth. So I kept renting out as much as I needed. Yes, go ahead.
But wait, office space for lawyers is not going to be the same as office space for doctors, right? Like,
Right.
We need things to be certain. There are certain health regulations that we need to be able to follow, and we have certain needs, right? I would assume, maybe incorrectly, that lawyers are not examining their clients. How is it that you're going to be able to utilize, this is not like a WeWork space where you're just sitting at a laptop and you need a place for coffee in the bathroom, like, and maybe a little conference room. Like, medical space is very specific. So how are you making that work?
Medical spaces are specific. The reason it works for me are a few things. One, I don't need equipment. So that has been big. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. The second thing is the space I'm in is I'm not allowed to do labs like blood draws and stuff or procedures. And I don't. So it is really a consultation. And so that's why it works.
Okay, so that's going to be one of the differences between some specialties.
Absolutely.
This is going to work, and other specialties, it's just so the proceduralists are ones in whom this model may not work as well, unless you can find a way to make your equipment affordable.
Yes, which is hard, which again, that is why ideally I was looking to sublease space from another practice where none of these problems would exist, which is why, again, I think, and the doctors working together, when we'll talk later about Link, this was the impetus for it.
So were there any other fixed expenses that you were able to turn into variable expenses, or you described what you're doing with office space, personnel? Are there any other things that we normally traditionally view as fixed expense that you've managed to make variable?
I don't think so. Everything else is pretty streamlined for me. I have EMR, which is fixed. I have a virtual assistant as my only staff. So that's a fixed expense too. Marketing is sort of variable, but again, that is not something we want to skimp on too much if it's going to affect the growth and viability of the practice. That's the big one.
I mean, you have to use an ambient AI scribe, right? That has to be the next way. You get, documentation kills us. And so the more you can rely, instead of hiring a VA, just saying, there are a lot of good AI scribes. And in fact, one of them is probably sponsoring this episode. So you found the office space. And then where did you go from there in terms of the sequence of events in building your practice?
It started off slow. I was also busy with many things on the personal front, so I was cool with that. I pounded the pavement, marketing it, meeting primary care physicians in the area. That, as a subspecialist, I get the word out. And I am really grateful to the first few physicians who, sent patients my way. And once they did, I think that it got the ball rolling. And I've been very grateful that most of them have been repeat referrers. It's the same with patients. In the beginning, I used to get questions like, hey, doc, why exactly are you here? And it made me really uncomfortable. I was not going around talking about my setup on the internet like now. I used to mumble something like I'm just starting out or something like that. And then very, very gradually, it's hard to say when the shift really occurred. But I realized that the value I'm providing to patients would be no better than if I worked in a fancy office with staff hovering over me. Because again, let me just point out that lean is not synonymous with cost cutting. Lean is a way of thinking where you're laser focused on providing value to your customer, in our case, our patients, and you make your processes as efficient with minimal waste as possible in order to provide that value. So it's the value that's central. And so when I realized that, in other words, that I was not going to be able to give them any better care than I was in the current setup, I began to feel a little bit better about it, which changed how I showed up and how I answered that question. And from there on, it just took off. Patient reviews have helped tremendously in my town for my specialty. I crop up on the top of the page on Google. Funnily, in fact, the office setup is part of many of those reviews. It'll say things like, hey, have you ever had a doctor come get you from the waiting room? Or if you want a dose of old school medicine, come here, that kind of stuff. So I guess patients like the attention and the time, because even if they're getting excellent care, many places, the time is not there. Even though I'm sure the physician has done everything on the back end to make sure nothing has been missed, they still feel like that was quick.
Well, patients often complain it's like going to a mom and pop store as opposed to a big box store, right? They feel like there's a more personal touch. Now, this is coming from a doctor who is in a practice that has 50 offices, right? We have 50 offices in my practice. And so sometimes we get complaints from patients that the care isn't as personalized as it used to be. And the answer is not true. It is just as personalized as it was when I was seeing you 12 years ago. It just so happens that my office has more infrastructure and it has to operate because of its scale. But they do sometimes appreciate that more personal concierge feel to it. The care is equal, but it's just a different vibe. I can totally appreciate that you came around and are now embracing that. Like, yes, the doctor's getting you. Of course the doctor's, why wouldn't I be getting you from the waiting room? You're my patient. Yeah.
True. And the dreaded rooming the patient. I mean, I don't see what the big deal about rooming is. Yes, except time. Again, none of this is to be penny wise and pound foolish, right? If you can see a few more patients without compromising care and have somebody else get the patient for you, then please go ahead and do that. This is just my model. And lean does not have to look a certain way. You can be a 50 location practice and still run lean by examining all of your processes and making sure there is no redundancy. Processes are kept simple and you are unclogging the bottlenecks, all of those things. And that is the lean way of thinking.
But I can imagine some of your patients complain about access, right? You're not there all the time. So it makes it harder to get appointment. Now, that being said, even when you come from a large hospital system, access is an issue, right? But I'm just wondering how you respond when your patients complain that it was hard to get oh, doc, I tried calling to get an appointment and I had to wait X amount of time, because unless they can get in right now, inevitably you're going to have someone complaining about the wait time, even if you're able to see them the next day, right? So in your lean practice, which by design, you're only going to be seeing people a couple of days a week, how do you respond when they mention that?
So I have only just begun to have this problem. It's a good problem because I've always had room for new patients within the week or the following week, and for established patients within the week for sure, because there've always been holes in the schedule. Even now, it's not terrible if you think about it compared to other practices. I can get a new patient in about 4-6 weeks or so, and actually even better than that, because
4 to 6 weeks. We have people complain when they can't be seen that day.
So, same day appointments are hard, but I guess it also depends on the nature of the practice. Nephrology, it's kidney disease, unless somebody is an acute glomerulonephritis or something, and those usually end up in the hospital. So some of this is going to be specialty specific, but my bread and butter is chronic kidney disease, which is long-term issues. So the standard for my specialty in my neck of the woods is a few months. But
a few weeks is definitely an improvement. Okay.
Yeah. And again, that is in theory because we have done some things. I have a wait list going of new patients and established patients. And anytime someone else cancels, we pull up patients from the wait list and get them in. Sometimes, often, the schedule finishes at, say, 3 or something, and I'll add in patients because I can technically see all the way until 5. So if somebody needs to be seen, I'm looking at the labs and I'm like, yeah, let me see them right away. So then I'll just add patients at, say, 4 o'clock or so. And same with the established patients. There are always last-minute cancellations, and we pull from the wait list. We text patients and use secure messaging, so it's easy. Hey, something opened up tomorrow or Friday, and televisits. So if an established patient really needs to be seen, then I can definitely see them the very same day or next day by televisit if I'm not able to accommodate them in the office. So I have not gotten much of that problem, but I can understand as time goes by that, yes. What are some things you've done that works for your practice in that regard? What have you found?
Well, no, it's just my verbal response to the complaint is something I still struggle with. Like, it's more like, how do I respond when people are like, man, doc, it's really hard to get an appointment with you. What should I be saying to that? Like, so what I think is like, well, why are they saying this? And then what is it that they want to hear in response? Because the reality of the situation is my time is finite and I can't expand it indefinitely in order to accommodate every issue because we just can't. Like, I've got my family. The same reason that you made a lean practice is because
Right.
you need to be able to spend time with your family. I need to be able to get home and spend time with my family. I need time for my own self-care. And there are times in which I can accommodate, an urgent issue, but there are always going to be people that are upset about it. And I'll say, you know what? We're a big practice. There's going to be someone in a different office maybe that's able to accommodate you. I'm sorry if it can't always be me. I find that way of like deflecting be the only way that I'm able to have a reasonable way. Like, yes, your problem is important. We have a system for handling that. But I can't always be that person. I just can't. But I won't apologize for it. That's something I've kind of gotten away from. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah. But maybe I should be a little less confrontational about it. There's probably a better way, which is why I was asking you. I was hoping you had a better line.
Right. Yeah, I don't get it very often yet. If I come up with something, I'll let you know.
As you were building your practice, were there any unforeseen expenses, right? As you're growing it, anything that came out of the woodwork and you went over your expenses, you're like, holy cow, where did this come from?
Not unforeseen per se, touch wood. The first time I hired a virtual assistant, my expenses doubled And there was a lot of brain drama around that time. I was taken aback at my own response. I did boil down to fear when I peeled back the layers. I think the money was neutral. Like, it was okay. The bank account was still okay. I think it was a feeling like, gosh, what if this fails? Because I have often said this line to myself: this is the only way I'm willing to do it. I am, be my own boss, that is. And so the fear was, what if this fails? And that came out in a major way when I hired the first virtual assistant. Yeah, it helped to talk through it. And now I can't imagine it without her.
But again, start lean and build from there. And then once you have the revenue to justify the expense, when you look at other practices and the finances of other practice, and you've got a Facebook group, right, where you talk about lean practice, what are some of the mistakes that you see with other practices where they're overspending?
Well, it's just like personal finance. If you overspend, you're never going to feel rich. Like, rich isn't comfortable, at peace, sleep at night. That feeling you take home is less. It's simple math. So I once came across a post in a different group. It was anonymous, and you asked, hey, I'm a GI specialist in a 6-member group, 6-physician group, and we can't make payroll. So I'm like, I don't get that. There should be no reason in the world that's happening unless something is off. I mean, either blatantly someone's stealing from them, or something is really wrong with the revenue cycle management.
And that happens often, the stealing. I mean, you just casually mentioned that, but that is, you hear about that all the time, where there's someone who's skimming.
So this brings me to the point that, yes, it's cool that you should try as a physician to maximize your time as a physician, because that's what brings in the revenue. But as a practice owner or partner, you have to wear the other hats. I like to say, they give the example of, say, an electrician or a plumber. If they start their own business, their own enterprise, they would never dream of not being on top of everything else, the finances. Yeah. They're like, this is my business. Of course I have to know. But I think traditionally, because there was plenty to go around, physicians were comfortable not being on top of that stuff, not knowing how efficient the billing is, how much is getting missed, what is not being followed up among denials, etc. Whether staff is redundant, if there are like 2 or 3 people at checkout and somebody is coming in every 25 minutes, a patient, and so like they have nothing to do, and they're standing and talking about Facebook.
When you look at other practices and you're trying to assess what's going on with them and how they can be more efficient, you drew the parallel to the plumber. But I think a big difference between a plumber and a physician is, if a plumber runs their business efficiently, they hire another plumber, they hire another plumber, they hire another plumber. Now they're managing a bunch of plumbers. Their time is best spent managing other plumbers. As a physician, though, if you hire another physician, hire another physician, hire another physician, revenue-wise, is your time best spent managing the practice, or is it best spent seeing patients and just overseeing the management of the practice? And I think the way, because we're high, we can bill high amounts, I think it makes more sense. And so I can understand why physicians are delegating that to someone else, right? It makes sense.
Absolutely. So delegation I don't think is the problem. I think it's oversight. And yes, of course, I mean, that is work too. That takes hours too. And it is often not the funnest job. It's HR after all. Probably the hardest part of managing, having a practice, owning a practice. But unfortunately, some sort of oversight is needed. Now, whether if you're a really big group and you can divvy it up among the partners, take turns doing it, and divvy up different kinds of roles. You oversee the billing, I'll oversee the HR. It's that kind of thing. I mean, something. But some of it needs to be done, because we hear these horror stories for no good reason. These are physicians working day and night. And I guess when they see the revenue go down, they again start seeing more patients, right? Because so that's the tragic part. Because again, don't burn me at the stake, but I think medicine, for the most part, still pays okay. It's not keeping up with inflation, and it hasn't gone up. All of that.
And student loans have increased, and there's a whole lot. Yes.
Yes,
but we're still if we're not in the 1%, we're in the 2% or maybe the 3%. So we still do well financially.
The processes are all like taken care of. And that's what, the lean principles say this. You look at all the values you provide, and you look at all the processes that go into providing a certain value. And then you name every step in that process. and see what could be done better, what can be eliminated. So that's pretty much the process we're talking about, but I guess we don't talk about it so formally, but that's at the end of the day what needs to be done.
So I'm going to push back on the lean practice model a little bit, because I think when physicians sign up to be physicians, we view ourselves in a certain way, and we are managers. We have the potential to be leaders, but in the position that we're often in, we're not the management, we're the labor. And so I think as medicine continues to evolve, we need to embrace the fact that we can be managers and not the labor, and then we can have advanced practice providers that work for us. And so this is going to lead to bloat, right? This is going to lead to a practice not being as lean, because then there's more overhead. But in doing so, we're going to be able to manage more patients effectively and increase access to care, as long as we are overseeing those people appropriately. So I think, lean practice, yes, you don't want to have waste. Lean meaning minimal waste, yes. But it doesn't necessarily mean not having significant overhead. It means having appropriate overhead.
You nailed it. Exactly. Okay. So yes, like I said before, lean is not synonymous with cost cutting. It is about being laser focused, obsessed with providing true value, not just vanity metrics. So for example, a vanity metric might be how many phone calls does my practice get? And is that a sign of how well I'm doing? But the true metric should be how easy is it for my patients to reach a human at the other end of the line when they need a question answered. So if you name all the values, of course, getting excellent care is first and foremost, but also other things, getting phone calls answered or returned, how long it takes to be seen, how long are they waiting in the waiting room on the day of the appointment. All of those things are all values we provide. So if we are just focused on providing those to the best of our ability, the redundancy automatically falls away, and therefore does the cost. So it's not about a certain overhead percentage or even a number, and every specialty will be different in its overhead, and that's all right as long as you're not wasting. So again, one big part of lean is it identifies 8 kinds of waste. Lean comes from manufacturing. It was Toyota, the car manufacturer, who over decades developed these guidelines by trial and error in their own factories and developed a blueprint for it. From there on, it went to other manufacturing companies, and from manufacturing, it has now been adopted by so many industries because it just makes sense. And I think in medicine, it makes perfect sense because we're trying to take care of a burgeoning demand with ever-shrinking resources. So yes, it is not about a certain amount of resource, but it is about the best use of the resources.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Now, in nephrology specifically, a significant part of the revenue comes from dialysis, right? But in lean practice, that's not something that you are taking part in, or is it?
Yes, I do take care of dialysis patients.
You get the revenue from the dialysis patients.
So dialysis care, like many other procedures, has 2 components, right? So the procedural fee goes to the large dialysis unit or whoever the dialysis provider is, and the physician gets paid for taking care of, it's a bundled payment, so you get a certain amount per month to take care of a patient. So yes, I get that.
But aren't there dialysis centers that are owned by nephrologists?
Yeah.
So they get the facility fee and the management fee.
Absolutely. Yes, they do. Those units are few and far between now because of regulatory changes and reimbursement changes that happen. But yes, if somebody owns the dialysis
consolidation,
unit,
right? There's like those,
and also consolidation.
Like a bunch of big players that bought up all of the units. Yeah. Okay.
Right. But yes, if they own it, then they get that. Yeah.
Okay. So you feel like in lean practice, you're not missing out because there aren't that many people there aren't that many nephrologists that are owning the dialysis.
Yeah. No, not anymore, I think. Yeah, I don't know specific numbers, but
another way that they're squeezing us out of the system.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's pivot to something more positive. So tell us about Link Medical Spaces, the Tinder of, and I coined that on this episode, the Tinder of physician office space.
Awesome. So yes, that is my drop in the ocean. And I was born out of my own experience. As I alluded to earlier, I was looking for space to sublease. I couldn't find any, neither could I find any resource to turn to. Because even if you were to look at a commercial real estate listing site, those only have office suites that are empty and ready to be leased. So this is the only medical specific online platform of its kind where you can either lease, of course, an entire space, but also sublease part of your office suite if you're not using it to the fullest, whether it's full-time or part-time. So say you're a surgeon and you're in the OR 2 days a week, and those 2 days, the office is empty. There's nobody there except your staff. So why don't you sublease it to a colleague who is maybe starting out a practice or wants to work part-time or is keeping things small for whatever reason, or even an established practice that is looking to start another location in elsewhere and again, go slow or start out slow and just need space a couple days. Or maybe you are an internist and you have a 5,000 square foot space and you're utilizing 4,000 of it well, and not the last 2 rooms at the end of the hallway. And those are full of boxes. Just clean them out, make them into exam rooms, and somebody can use them. So that way you're optimizing it, reducing waste. You're turning the your own office space into a passive revenue stream because, like we said, it is expensive whether you own your space or lease it. And on the platform, it's at a no cost and not the thousands that you may be paying a realtor to get this done. And you're helping out a colleague. So
amazing. Amazing. Well, necessity is the mother of invention, and Dr. Sadhu is the mother of Link Medical Spaces. So it's it's amazing. It's such a great idea, and how that was born out of, your need. So inevitably there are going to be other people that have that same issue. So, and that's linkmedicalspaces.com.
That's right.
And so if people want to find out more about running a lean medical practice, they want your advice, how do people find you and get in touch?
I'm easy to reach. I'm all over Facebook with my name, Sanghamitra Sadhu. And I have the Facebook group, which is Link Private Practice Solutions, and a blog of the same name. Or they can email me, which is hello@linkmedicalspaces.com.
Sorry, I think you misspoke. Did you mean Lean Private Practice Solutions? You said Link Private Practice.
Lean Private Practice Solutions.
Okay, so Lean Private Practice Solutions or Link Medical Spaces. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for all that you do for your patients and for helping us run lean practices.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.